You, in the book, you address 10 claims that are commonly used basically to suggest or to posit the idea that the Bible doesn't explicitly condemn or forbid same-sex relationships. And the first one that we won't go through all 10, we'll run out of time, but there's a few that really stand out to me that we can talk about now. The first one is just that Christians should stay focused on the gospel of God's love, and we shouldn't get distracted with these non-essential issues like sexuality. And when it comes to these non-essentials, we should just sort of choose love and choose to live and let live, so that we keep the main thing the main thing. How do you address that in the book, and what do people need to know about that claim?
Yeah, I mean, I think to start with, as with many of the claims of the book, it's a very understandable question to be asking.
Sure.
And especially if you live in a place like I do in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Christian sexual ethics is wildly controversial, and where there'll be many people, in my neighborhood and in my circles here, who, knowing that I believe the Bible doesn't affirm same-sex sexual relationships in any form, that would be a reason for them to not even consider Christianity. So I can understand somebody saying, do you know what, I'm passionate about people coming to know Jesus. This feels like a real roadblock. Why can't we just sort of set it aside and say, look, maybe this is like baptism where Christians can agree to disagree, and we just, we don't need to break fellowship over this or make it a bigger issue. I think there are two substantial problems with that. One is that Jesus himself and the New Testament authors seem to take sexual sin exceedingly seriously. People sometimes think that Jesus kind of loosened up the Old Testament law when it came to all sorts of things, including sexual sin. Actually, Jesus tightens it up. Famously in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "You've heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.' I say to you, anyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery in his heart."
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say, if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out, because it's better to enter the kingdom of God without an eye than it is to keep your eyes and to be thrown into hell. I mean, it couldn't be more serious. Jesus's understanding of sin in general and sexual sin in this context in particular as well. So I think it's really important for us to then answer the question: well, what is and is not sexual sin? Now, I think the other reason why I don't think we can set these questions aside and just kind of quite focus on the gospel is that actually, if you look at the big picture from the Old Testament to the New Testament of what Christian marriage as the context for sexual intimacy is about, it's actually about the gospel. So we see it in the Old Testament as time and again the prophets compare God to a loving, faithful husband and Israel to his all too often unfaithful wife. God's people are always cheating on him with these other idols, these sort of so-called gods. And it seems like this marriage between God and his people is in crisis. Time and again, it's just sort of God forgives and draws his people back, and then they cheat on him again. Like it's just this sort of cycle.
Yeah.
That we see throughout the Old Testament. And then we see Jesus step onto the stage of human history. And one of the strange claims that he makes about himself is that he is the bridegroom. Which is a very odd thing for a man to say who never got married in his life on earth. So you're thinking, what is this about? Well, actually, it's one of the ways in which Jesus is stepping into the shoes of the creator God of the Old Testament. He's saying, I'm the groom, I'm the husband. I've come to claim God's people for myself. And we see that further explained in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, where he describes Christian marriage as like a little sort of scale model of Jesus' love for his people. We see it at the very end of the Bible in the book of Revelation, when this sort of recurrent metaphor comes back of Jesus as the lamb, actually, in this context, getting married to his people, to the church. Mm-hmm. And how Jesus' sort of wedding, his marriage to his church, brings heaven and earth back together. So this is the big picture from the Old to the New Testament of what marriage is about. And Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, says that even from the very beginning, so at the very beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis in chapter 2, when God brings the first man and the first woman together, and we read this sort of curious verse at the end of Genesis 2, "Therefore a man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." Paul says, this is a profound mystery, and I'm saying it refers to Christ and the church. So actually from the very beginning, God's design for marriage as a one flesh union between one man and one woman was all about Jesus and his people. So rather than being a roadblock to the gospel, Christian sexual ethics is actually meant to be a signpost to the gospel. And the love across difference of one man and one woman in marriage, the one flesh union between them, is meant to be a sort of picture of the love across difference of Jesus and his people, the one flesh union between Christ and his church.
Yeah.
And I think so often when we have conversations, even in sort of Christian circles about sexual ethics, we miss that central vision. We actually sort of take the gospel out of the conversation, and we end up having a conversation which honestly I don't think is ultimately about Christian sexual ethics. It might be about sort of conservative ethics or something, but it's not Christian sexual ethics if it doesn't have Jesus right at the center of it. So actually,
Wow.
I think the gospel is pointed to by the claims that the Bible makes about sex. And what I sometimes say to friends who are not Christians is listen, Christian sexual ethics is much weirder than you think. You know, it's not just that I think that sex only belongs in marriage between one man and one woman, but I think this is all about a metaphor. And the whole purpose, the whole point of this is giving us a tiny glimpse of the kind of powerful, sacrificial, flesh-uniting, life-creating, never-ending, exclusive love that Jesus has for us.